So I'm here with Nova Cadamatre. She's the director of winemaking here at Robert Mondavi Winery, and we're in the famed To Kalon Vineyard, which is not small.
Not small.
So we're doing a little walk around, and we've stopped in this monastery block with some Merlot. Tell us what's going on here, because the Merlot has not been picked yet.
This clone of Merlot hasn't been picked yet, no. So this one's a little bit later ripening. We do have another clone that's on the end of this block that we already picked that we'll be tasting a little bit later. But what we're seeing this year is just a beautiful ripening of all the fruit. So a lot of color, a lot of tannin, basically anything a winemaker could want, you're gonna get it this year. So that's really, really exciting, particularly after last year. And so we're here and you see in the fruit, we'll be picking this early next week and it's just perfect right now. It's just starting to soften and you're seeing really beautiful tannin development this year. So we're very excited about this block.
And I was asking just before we went on camera, a little surprising that Merlot is still hanging at this point. Talking about the tannins in Merlot, you said they can be aggressive, which is not what most people think of when they think of Merlot.
Exactly. Most people think of Merlot as like the soft, plush one, and then Cabernet as like the really tannic one. And while it's true that Merlot has empirically less tannin than Cabernet, they're very different textures. And so unripe Merlot tannins can be kind of green and a little bit sandy. And so you want them to make sure that they're more rounded and smooth before you pick. Whereas Cabernet tannins are very fine and velvety pretty much all the way through. And so when you're blind tasting between the two, if you're looking for which one's Merlot, which one's Cabernet, sometimes looking for the little rougher tannin is the key to which one is the Merlot.
Okay, I'm going to use that going forward. Thanks for that tip.
You're welcome.
And then also you mentioned that there's just the softening of the clusters. Is that something that you correlate to tannin development?
Yes.
And when we say softening, we're talking about the skins.
The skins, yeah. The skins have been super crunchy. So like for those people who love to get grapes in the grocery store, like that crunch. That happens in our fruit too, but that's how you know it's not ripe. And so we're waiting for the skins to kind of soften a bit and be a little more gentle when you're tasting them versus that initial pop or crunch that you get.
Okay, and we got a couple more stops we're going to make to look at some Cabernet, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, making our second stop here with Nova in the vineyards in To Kalon for Robert Mondavi Wine Company. And tell us where we are and what we're doing.
Sure, so we're on the south part of the ranch. This is Block P North. It's all Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's a really fun block because the soil changes quite a bit and the water availability changes quite a bit in this block. So we have everything from Robert Mondavi Cabernet Sauvignon Reserve all the way to the Robert Mondavi Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon in this same block. And it really all has to do with where the water is and how it flows through the vineyard. And so we see more water stress up at the north part of the block. And that is more of our reserve section. As we go through the middle of the block, we get into our Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon area, and all the way down the south end of the block is our Napa Cabernet.
And this is one of your bigger blocks.
Yes.
And pretty prominent that it's making the wine for all those brands that you have.
Absolutely.
So what are you seeing right now? You said this is going to be picked in a couple days. So when you're tasting these berries, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that you're making the decision based on?
Sure. I think the real key decision this vintage, and every year changes a little bit, but this vintage really has been the evolution of the tannins. That's been the story of the vintage because the sugar jumped very early, but now we've been kind of waiting on the tannins to really round and soften and really get to that velvety texture. And this is right in the window where we want it to be.
And again, that's the texture of the skins as much as the flavor and everything else that you're getting in there, the color of the seeds, all that sort of stuff.
Yes, exactly. So, we're seeing really good extraction of the color from the skins. We're seeing really fine texture of the tannins. We're seeing great flavor development. And so we've kind of come through that more neutral flavor zone, and now we're into that blue and black fruit zone, which is exactly where we want to be.
But since this is a large block and it's earmarked for different lots, how much variability are you getting in that flavor development through the block?
Quite a bit. So what we do as a winemaking team is we'll walk like every 20 rows in this block. And so we do spend a lot of time in this block identifying exactly where the flavor changes are and where the tannin changes are. And so we determine every year exactly where the cutoff points are for each program and each pick. And so that's part of what we do this time of year is walk every day and in the morning, especially on mornings like this when it's so nice and cool, and determine exactly where to stop on all the picks.
And so that was sort of what we were talking about just before off camera when you're saying you're treating the vineyard now more like a Grand Cru rather than a first growth, which means more like a Burgundian micro approach rather than the large scale approach.
Absolutely, absolutely, because there's so many different changes in soil types and slopes and aspects in here, and so really understanding where all those are by walking is the only way to do it.
So we're making our third and final stop on our little vineyard walk here with Nova Cadamatre and Robert Mondavi Winery and To Kalon. We're in Robert's block.
Robert's block.
We know who Robert is. pretty different from what we've been looking at before. So younger vines here, you said planted in 2018.
Planted in 2018, very young vines. Last year was its first harvest.
And we're seeing the kind of the ravages of a dry season here.
Yes, yeah. So you can definitely see the basil yellowing. That's, you know, kind of end of season water stress at this point. We did see a lot of shatter in this block early in the season because it was such a cool flowering period.
Show us some of the
Yes, you
there.
can definitely see that this is, you know, not a full bunch at all, but the clusters that are left have been really nice. They've sized up well. And we're also still seeing really small berry size. So, you know, if you look at here, this is pretty tiny, and that's what we want for quality and concentration. And so, you know, I can't help but be pretty happy with what we're seeing.
Right, so you're getting a little bit less here, but you're still happy with the quality overall.
Absolutely.
What have you done here differently than what you're doing in the other parcels to sort of get this to the finish line?
Sure. So one of the things, this is a pretty big block, and so because it's very new, we don't really know how it reacts to different stresses yet. So we started picking at the far end of the block earlier in the week. We're picking this middle section early next week, and then the end of next week we'll pick the far section. And that'll give us kind of a span of about 2 weeks where we can understand how the vine's reacting to the weather, and did we like the quality of the earlier pick or the later pick. And so that'll help inform our picking decisions going into the next couple of seasons.
And is it easier to do that kind of experimentation on a younger block because you're also getting to know that block versus doing it on an older block that's more established?
Well, we do it on some blocks if we feel like our picking decisions aren't spot on. So we'll do this kind of experimental, like we should pick some early, some late. Sometimes we do it just to have complexity, you know, having some a little more early fruit profiles, some a little later fruit profiles. And then when you're blending them all together, that makes the blend more interesting to have different characteristics.
And when you learn something in a block like this, does it teach you something about other blocks in the vineyard?
It can, for sure. Yeah, we can definitely learn different things, but every vintage is different. So because something worked last vintage doesn't mean it's going to 100% work next vintage, although it can help you guide your decisions going forward.
Okay.